afternoon, everybody. It is nice to be doing this presentation. This isn't exactly how I anticipated doing this. I know we had this set up in front of a live audience, but under the circumstances, this certainly seems like the most appropriate way to do our presentation today. So several months ago, some of you may have come to a presentation here at Vine that I did, and the topic was the aging brain. And I ended up not getting through all of that material. So what I thought I would do today is kind of do almost the second half of that presentation. So we will talk a little bit today about kind of normal aging and changes that happen with cognition as we get older. We'll also be talking a little bit about how to distinguish some of those normal changes in cognition with aging and Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, so we'll spend some time doing that as well. We'll also be looking at how we might be able to prevent cognitive decline in the future, and also highlighting some of the risk factors for dementia, particularly ones that we might be able to influence or change in some way. So one of the reasons why I like doing presentations like this is that I think there's a lot of need for this kind of information. One of the things that I know in my work here at Vine and in my work with older adults in the community is that a lot of individuals over the age of 65 are concerned about their memory. They're concerned about possibly losing their memory, and they're also concerned about possibly developing Alzheimer's disease. And we know that survey research shows that individuals over the age of 65, one of their greatest concerns is losing their memory. It's right behind losing physical capabilities. But otherwise, memory concerns are near the top of the list. And so there's a decent chance that if you're watching this, you probably have some concerns about your own memory, or perhaps the memory and cognitive functioning of somebody that you love and care for. So that's one of the reasons why I do these presentations, because this is one of my areas of expertise. So with that being said, we'll kind of move into, and what I wanted to start with is just do a brief overview of some of the material that I spent a lot of time with in the presentation last fall. So I'm just going to do some really brief kind of overviews of normal changes that happen in the brain as we age, and how those changes in the brain then kind of manifest or show themselves in terms of changes in thinking and memory and other cognitive abilities. So as we get older, it's fairly normal to experience some atrophy or shrinking in brain tissue. Now, that's usually not as pronounced as many people think, but most older adults do show some of that atrophy as they get older. But this is generally not shrinking or atrophy that occurs throughout the brain. There are certain areas of the brain that are a bit more vulnerable to this kind of atrophy. And one area in particular is this prefrontal cortex, this area right up here. Those are areas of the brain, both on the right and left side, that have very important functions in terms of more complex cognitive abilities. So the ability to plan out a meal, the ability to organize information, the ability to control our impulses, for example, the ability to put short-term memories into long-term memories, the ability to focus and sustain attention. All of these things are partly responsible through the frontal cortex. Many of our social abilities are also kind of partly controlled by that prefrontal cortex. So that's an area of the brain that's probably hit the hardest by atrophy, and some studies have shown that after the age of 50, between the ages of 50 and 90, about 30% of that brain matter is lost over time in that particular area of the brain. So that is definitely going to manifest itself in some cognitive changes. There's also changes in atrophy in the temporal lobes, that are kind of right up here above our ears. Those are areas of the brain that are responsible for auditory or hearing kind of processing. So that's a primary focus of the temporal lobes. And then an area of the brain that's very important for short-term memory and consolidating memories. For example, consolidating memory with emotions is the hippocampus, and that's a part of the brain that's very vulnerable in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. So the hippocampus also shows roughly in the average older adult about 20% decline from ages 50 to 90, or 50%, or I should say 20% atrophy in that area of the brain. So those are some areas of the brain that are most kind of affected by normal aging processes. And most of this atrophy actually is due to water loss. There is some neuronal or nerve cell loss, but a lot of that atrophy is due to water loss. But there is some loss of nerve cell tissue in the brain as well. What we also see at a very microscopic level with regard to nerve cells is that the branching of nerve cells tends to become less. So our nerve cells are connected in multiple ways. And what we see is those connections begin to shrink, and there's fewer of those connections. So when two nerve cells connect, there's a small gap, which you can kind of see here between my fingers. It's called a synapse. And that's an area where there are transmission of neurotransmitters, brain chemicals that pass messages along that allow us to think and reason and do other kinds of cognitive abilities. And they're also very important with our emotional functioning as well. So what we see with normal aging is that there's fewer of those synapses because those connections or those spines that happen and nerve cells begin to shrink, and there's fewer of them. And so there's fewer synapses, which means that we might see a slowing or a changing in some of our thinking processes and in some of our emotional functioning. Another thing that we also see is a reduced oxygen supply to the brain, possibly due to reduced blood flow. And then we also see some changes in brain chemistry as well. So certain neurotransmitters, those brain chemicals that transmit messages from one cell to another, we produce somewhat less of those things in older age, particularly if we have poor lifestyle with regard to diet and exercise and mental activity, things that we'll talk about a little bit later. But with normal aging, we do tend to see a reduction in the production of some of those neurotransmitters, and there's fewer receptors on brain cells to kind of receive those neurotransmitters. And really what that means is that that's another reason why we might see changes in thinking and memory and emotional functioning as well. So all of these brain changes that are happening manifest themselves in different ways. So there are some relatively stable and pretty well known changes that happen as we get older that are pretty normal, that happen with your average older individual. And one of the most robust and consistent findings is that you'll see a slowing of reaction time. You'll see slower information processing. So that ability to take in information, make some sense out of it, and then respond accordingly to our environment. That's information processing. And what we see with older age is that process will begin to slow. It's not deficient in any way, it just tends to be a bit slower. So sometimes it just takes us a little bit longer to process information, think things through, and particularly maybe solve novel problems as opposed to problems that we're very used to solving. So reaction time and information processing are pretty reliably things that slow down a bit as we get older. Some of those brain changes may also affect our ability to sustain attention over longer periods of time. So individuals may find that they're more distractible as they get older, and that ability to kind of tune out distractions and stay focused is a relatively normal change that begins to happen as we get older. And then that ability to inhibit responses. So we might find that individuals are a little bit more distractible, and they may have a little bit harder time inhibiting responses. We also see that new learning, so again, learning new things, the efficiency of that process slows. Individuals, of course, are still able to do that, but that process just is a little bit slower. So it often takes a bit more effort and a bit more time to learn complex new information. People are certainly able to do that, of course, in older age. Now, we'll talk more about memory later on, and memory is actually a lot of different skills. And there's some areas of memory that aren't really impacted by aging all that much. And then there's other aspects or other memory skills that do change quite a bit as we get older. And one of those areas of memory that does tend to decline as we get older is called recall memory. And that basically just means when you have to remember information without any or very few hints or clues. So if I were to ask you, for example, what is my name? That's a question that requires recall memory. I'm not giving you any hints or clues, I'm just asking you an open-ended question, what's my name? And that's a skill that we do see that tends to decline as individuals get older. Now, for example, recognition memory then is a type of memory that is not affected all that much by aging. So if instead of me just asking you what's my name, if I were to say, is my name Jeff, John, or Jack, I've given you the correct answer. You don't know which one it is, but we often know it when we hear it. So we don't have to pull it out of memory. We've got some sort of environmental support or clues to help us. And that's a type of memory that stays relatively well preserved. Working memory is another type of memory that we do see declines in as individuals get older. And that's a fairly consistent finding across a lot of research. So working memory is this ability to actively manipulate and store information at the same time. So a couple of just examples of what working memory can look like is if you're trying to drive in a busy area and remember directions at the same time. So in a sense, you're trying to remember information, hold it in memory and store it there, and do something else at the same time. In this example, navigate or drive in a area. That kind of memory is much more impacted, and that's going to be a harder task for many older individuals. Another example of working memory might involve having a conversation with somebody, and you're listening to them, and then you're also thinking about what you want to say next or how you're going to respond. So you're trying to remember what it is you want to say next, but also trying to pay attention to and listen to the person across from you. That's a working memory task as well. So if you find yourself in those kind of situations, and then the other person is done speaking, and then you forget what you want to say, well, that's a working memory task, and that is another area of memory that tends to decline as we get older. So sometimes those kind of multitasking things become more challenging as we get older. Just remembering the names of things or names of people, what's called confrontation naming, that is a skill that tends to steadily decline as we get older. Another skill called verbal fluency, our ability to articulate information and articulate it relatively quickly, is something that also tends to decline as we get older. So a fairly common verbal fluency test that we give, for example, might be name as many animals with 4 legs as you can in 30 seconds. So you have to look into your memory and find those things. You have to organize information in certain ways, for example, animals in a zoo or animals on a farm, and then be able to articulate those responses as quickly as you can and get out as many answers as you can in 30 seconds. That's a verbal fluency task, and that becomes harder typically as we get older. Visual construction is another skill that tends to decline as we get older. So that ability to construct things and use hand-eye coordination. So things like putting a puzzle together, navigating in a new city, for example, being able to pack a car with suitcases and things most efficiently. Those kind of skills may decline somewhat as we get older. So all those changes in the brain that we talked about before, in terms of reductions and changes in neurotransmitters or those brain chemicals, those changes in nerve cells where we see the fewer synapses and those fewer connection between nerve cells, these are ways that those declines in brain functioning manifest themselves on a day-to-day basis for the average older individual. Whether you experience these kind of changes may very much depend on your physical health, your diet, your levels of activities, that kind of thing. So what we find in general is that these kind of changes may not affect individuals a great deal on a day-to-day basis, but when an older individual is asked to learn something new, to process lots of information and to process it quickly, that's where an older individual is going to be at a bit more of a disadvantage. But many older individuals don't find themselves in situations like that very often. So these changes, they do occur, but they tend not to have a great deal of impact on people's day-to-day life. So when people do experience some of these changes, and some common examples that I hear is people forgetting the names of individuals that they see, like the grocery store, for example, or in church. People begin to get a little bit worried. Does this mean that I'm experiencing maybe the early stages of Alzheimer's disease? And so there are some general guidelines on this next slide that we use to try to determine whether somebody's just experiencing the normal changes that happen with aging that we just described, or whether they might be experiencing something more significant like Alzheimer's disease or a related condition. And some of these general guidelines is, first of all, how frequently do these changes in memory and thinking happen? If they're happening every once in a while, every few days, once a week, a couple times a month, that's generally not as big of a concern. But if they're happening every day, multiple times a day, that's when we might be a little bit more concerned about somebody's memory or thinking processes. How severe these problems are also is something that we try to gauge. Is it impacting your day-to-day life? Is it affecting your ability to drive or do other daily activities that normally you could do fairly easily and now you might be struggling with a bit more? That's when we become a bit more concerned. Sometimes people will describe to me things like, again, I'm having difficulty remembering the names of people. I walk into a room and I can't remember why I went in there. Those are generally things that don't concern me too much. But when we see changes in multiple cognitive areas, so if somebody's describing memory problems, language difficulties, they're having a hard time reasoning through fairly simple kinds of problems, that's when we're going to get a bit more concerned. So when there's changes and potential declines in multiple cognitive areas, that's a greater concern than just one area of functioning that's maybe not doing as well. We also need to look at the course, or how these memory and thinking changes occur over time. So do they seem to be getting worse over time? Has the individual, for example, maybe tried to compensate in certain ways, like carrying a notebook or a calendar around, and now they're finding that those compensatory strategies aren't working as well? Those are other things that we look at. So if things are getting worse over time, and it seems like the person is trying to compensate, but those compensatory strategies aren't working as well anymore, that's when we also get concerned. If somebody has a family history of Alzheimer's disease, that's something that also may concern us if some of these other changes are happening as well. And then I also have on the slide here what are called biomarkers, and there's a lot of research going on right now looking at, are there biological factors that we can measure that determine somebody's risk of developing Alzheimer's disease or other conditions. So this might involve a blood test, this might involve brain scanning, this might involve tapping cerebrospinal fluid and looking for certain biological factors that tell us that somebody's got some biological changes happening that may put them at greater risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And those biomarkers may be more meaningful if somebody has a family history. So we may be more likely to detect those biomarkers. Right now, there's not widely available, easy and inexpensive biomarker test, but in the future, there may be a simple blood test, or there may be other biological kinds of things that can be measured reliably that will help people determine what their risk is. Right now, those tests are being developed, they're being researched, but they're not widely available in typical clinical settings. So those are some general guidelines that we look at to distinguish dementia from normal changes in aging. This next slide is straight from the Alzheimer's Association publication. It's called the 10 Early Signs. These are very specific things that people may notice on a day-to-day basis that may be early signs of Alzheimer's disease. So clearly things like forgetting information, particularly short-term memory. So if the person's asking questions repeatedly, for example, if they're consistently losing items, those kind of memory problems are a hallmark, of course, of Alzheimer's disease. But there may be some other signs as well. For example, difficulties in planning and problem solving. So this might involve completing a checkbook, preparing a meal, things that the person was able to do fairly easily before. Now those more complex multi-step tasks become more challenging to carry out. And that's kind of one of the next signs as well, is difficulty completing familiar tasks. So things that the person was able to do relatively well before, they may find that they have more difficulties doing that. That may be one of those early signs. The person may experience confusion with time or place, so they may not be aware of what season it is, or have a hard time keeping track of what day of the week it is, or what month it is, or what time of day it is. So there may be some confusion about time or place. Difficulties with images and spatial relationships, so the individual may have some difficulties with seeing. They may have difficulties, again, navigating in familiar places and finding their way, whether they're driving or whether they might be in a mall, that type of thing. May also become impaired in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. If the person's having problems with language, particularly new kinds of problems with finding words or speaking, if they're having difficulties maintaining conversations, if they're having difficulties keeping up with conversations, that may be one of those early signs. If they're having difficulties writing effectively, you may see that the individual uses fewer words or uses simpler sentences and such. Those may be some subtle signs that there's some changes happening as well. Misplacing things, but then not having the ability to retrace their steps and find it. Many individuals, regardless of age, will misplace things, but many of us are able to reason through things like, when's the last time I saw it? Where would be a typical place that I would leave this object? And be able to reason through, and in most cases be able to find what it is they're looking for. Somebody in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease may not have that ability. They may not be able to find items, and then they may just forget that they forgot it. So those are some ways to distinguish what is more normal versus something that might be an early sign of Alzheimer's disease. Difficulties with judgment, so making poor decisions, things like maybe not dressing appropriately for the weather, spending excessive amounts of money, that type of thing. That may also happen in the early stages. Beginning to withdraw from social activities. So if you're having difficulties keeping up with conversation, if you're having difficulties participating in conversation, having a hard time finding words, having a hard time remembering, it's no wonder that people might begin to socially withdraw. And then you may also see some changes in mood, particularly depression, maybe irritability, maybe some anxiety. And then another condition which we call apathy, which is somewhat similar to depression, but apathy is a little bit different and may be a fairly common and commonly missed early sign that there's some cognitive changes happening with somebody. And apathy really refers to when an individual seems to have very little motivation. They seem to have very little interest in starting activities. They seem very indifferent to the things that are happening around them, like they just don't care. So it's not even just that they're not interested, but they just seem to not care about what's going on around them and about doing anything. And that's a little bit different than depression, although there's some similarities, but that apathy may be an early sign of cognitive changes that's often missed. And so now what I want to do is, we did that kind of brief overview of changes that happen in the brain, how those changes in the brain manifest themselves in terms of cognitive changes that we might notice on a daily basis. We looked at how we can distinguish some of those normal changes from Alzheimer's disease and related conditions. That's material that I covered quite a bit in the previous talk that I had done, and that gives you kind of a quick overview of that material. One area that I did not get to spend a lot of time with in my last presentation that I wanted to spend more time with this time around is looking at prevention strategies. Are there ways that we can maximize our cognitive function as we get older? Are there ways that we might be able to slow down these cognitive changes in some way? And the hope is even that perhaps some of these risk factors and some of these lifestyle factors that we're going to talk about, will they be useful for preventing Alzheimer's disease, or maybe even delaying the onset? So if we do certain things, could it maybe, for example, instead of us getting at this at the age of 75, maybe we delay the onset to age 80 or early 80s? So there's no tried and true recipe or way to prevent Alzheimer's disease. But there are some things that we can do that might be able to improve our cognitive functioning and maybe slow cognitive decline. And there actually are a lot of people out there, a lot of professionals and researchers who do believe that some significant lifestyle changes, both in midlife and in older age, could potentially prevent maybe even up to half of cases of Alzheimer's disease. There's still, I think, a lot of research to be done with that, but there's a lot of people that are quite hopeful that risk factor management and lifestyle changes may have a big impact on changing how many people and reducing how many people develop this disease, slowing down cognitive decline, or as I said before, maybe even delaying the onset of the disease. So the general recipe, if you will, based on the best evidence that we have available, involves really four things: increasing physical activity, controlling our cardiovascular risk factors, and really just general vascular risk factors, increasing social engagement, and increasing mental activity. So we'll talk about each of those in a little bit more detail and try to give you some specific tips along the way. One of the things you may notice if you're looking at some of the slides here as well is that some of the items in the slides are bolded. And what that means is that those are some factors that have been very consistently and very strongly associated with the development of Alzheimer's disease. So we're going to go through a lot of risk factors for developing dementia, but those ones in bold seem to be the ones that are the most important risk factors and have the most robust evidence supporting that these are risk factors for developing Alzheimer's disease later on in life. And so if we start with physical activity, if I was going to recommend one thing to people to try to improve their cognitive functioning or delay cognitive decline, it would be increasing physical activity. It is related to changing vascular risk factors because we know that exercise is very good for our heart, it's very good for our brain as well. So it can improve or alter other cardiovascular and vascular risk factors. So physical exercise can affect blood pressure, for example, blood sugars, for example. It can increase blood flow. So there's a lot of benefits that come with exercise. And it can really increase that blood flow in that area of the brain that we talked about before called the hippocampus. And that's that part of the brain that's really, really important for developing and consolidating short-term memories and then helping them to eventually convert those into longer-term memories. So damage to the hippocampus will definitely show itself in terms of short-term memory loss. And physical exercise can help improve blood flow to that area of the brain and perhaps help us improve our memory functioning. Exercise may also help us decrease amyloid. And amyloid is a sticky protein that occurs in the plaques that are one of the hallmark signs of Alzheimer's disease. So you may have heard of plaques and tangles, and plaques are made of a sticky protein called beta amyloid. And physical exercise may help decrease that amyloid production and may help decrease the development of those plaques. And then one of the other things that physical exercise does is it increases the production of substances called growth factors. And really what those things help do is improve the branching of those neurons. So as I was talking about before, one of the things that happens fairly commonly as we get older is that the branching of neurons, those branches that branch out to other neurons and connect with other neurons and have those synapses and those connections with other neurons, some of those begin to shrink and get shortened. So there are fewer connections. Physical exercise helps maintain and perhaps even grow new branches on neurons to help neurons communicate more effectively. And another thing that exercise can do, and maybe one of the best ways to do this, is what's called neurogenesis, or basically the development and the creation of new brain cells. Not all that long ago, it was basically thought that once you got into childhood, early adolescence, you had all the brain cells that you had for the rest of your life. We now know that people do develop and they do grow new brain cells, which is called neurogenesis. And physical exercise may be one way to kind of speed up that process or help that process of neurogenesis. So physical exercise has a lot of benefits. There's been some studies that have shown that men who regularly physically exercise may have a 50% less risk of developing dementia. For women, that reduction in risk may be up to 60%. And another thing that I think is very important as well, for people who already have Alzheimer's disease, individuals who are more physically active who have Alzheimer's disease, they will show less decline over time as well. So there are some real benefits to even individuals with Alzheimer's disease currently. There are some real benefits to them in terms of slowing down perhaps some decline, but also reducing that atrophy in the brain as well. So then one of the things that's becoming very clear now with newer research is that vascular risk factors, both in midlife and in old age, really can increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease. So you notice that there's a few items on this next slide that are bolded. High blood pressure, smoking, diabetes. And the thing about high blood pressure and diabetes is that when individuals develop high blood pressure and diabetes, even in middle age, so in their 40s and 50s, that increases the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease in the future. So high blood pressure and diabetes are risk factors for older adults as well, but even having those risk factors in midlife can increase our chances of developing this disease later on in life as well. And really of those, diabetes seems to be one of the strongest risk factors of anything, and particularly developing diabetes in midlife seems to be very important as a risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease in the future. So one of the things that may happen is that individuals develop insulin resistance and then eventually maybe developing diabetes, is that can affect memory functioning. It can contribute to the development perhaps of those plaques and those tangles that are associated with Alzheimer's disease. So diabetes is a particularly nasty risk factor that's very important to monitor even in middle age. So that's really important. And the same thing with high blood pressure as well. So these cardiovascular and these vascular risk factors make a big difference. People have a history of stroke, heart disease, high cholesterol, maybe also be at a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease as well. And the severity of cognitive decline is greater in those individuals who have these cardiovascular risk factors. So if you have these vascular risk factors, and then you also perhaps develop some of the early signs of Alzheimer's disease, it seems like Alzheimer's disease may progress more rapidly and more quickly in individuals who already have vascular risk factors as well. Things again like hypertension, high cholesterol, or diabetes. So maintaining vascular health is really important. So if something is good for your heart, it's good for your brain. If it's good for your blood vessels around your heart, it's good for your blood vessels in the brain as well. And then if we look at things like dietary factors, which of course contribute to vascular risk factors too. If we look at dietary factors, we note that there's certain kinds of foods that may be more beneficial. So particularly foods that are high in antioxidants. So those antioxidant foods, what they do is they neutralize those what are called oxygen-free radicals. Those free radicals can do a lot of damage to our cells, and particularly neurons, and that may contribute partly to cell death and may contribute to Alzheimer's disease as well. So those oxygen-free radicals, one of the ways to neutralize them is to consume foods that are high in antioxidants. So vitamins A, C, E, and selenium. And some of those foods that are particularly high in antioxidants include things like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, spinach, strawberries. Those are some examples of foods that are both high in antioxidants, and some of those foods are also high in what are called omega-3 fatty acids. Now, omega-3 fatty acids have been linked to potentially developing Alzheimer's disease in the future. So individuals who consume, for example, more fish that's high in omega-3 fatty acids seem to have a lower risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. But unfortunately, not all that long ago, a study was done, a very large research study, looked at individuals who consumed high amounts of omega-3 fatty acids and then compared them to individuals who did not, and unfortunately did not find a link. So when there was an experimental study done looking at people who consumed a lot of this omega-3 fatty acid versus people who did not, they did not find any difference in the development of Alzheimer's disease across those groups. So that was a very unfortunate finding. But omega-3 fatty acids may still have some benefit in terms of improving the health of neurons or those brain cells, helping those synapses or those connections and helping those function better. So omega-3 fatty acids may have some benefits still in terms of reducing inflammation, and we know that inflammation is also something that is a risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease. And so omega-3 fatty acids may also have antioxidant properties as well. So the evidence is mixed with omega-3s, but there does seem to be at least potentially some benefit in terms of improving the health of neurons, maybe some benefits with in terms of memory, I should say, but there doesn't seem to be a real impact as far as changing the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease in the future. And one of the things that's very important with these dietary factors is that the research is fairly consistent that consuming foods high in these particular vitamins and minerals seems to be more beneficial than taking supplements. So that is fairly important to be able to take those in through our diet. So that seems to be something that is more beneficial for us. And there's been some quite a bit of research done on something that you may have heard of called the Mediterranean diet. So individuals from Spain, France, Italy tend to consume diets that are high in fruits, vegetables, some cheese, yogurt, whole grains, typically lean proteins like fish and then maybe chicken as well. They tend to consume more olive oil. That this particular diet may be associated with a lower risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, and there is some evidence for that. So dietary factors, all in all, can have can increase potential risk for developing Alzheimer's disease, and if we make dietary changes, they may be helpful for maybe improving or changing our cognitive functioning to some extent. Another piece of the recipe involves also social activities. So this does not necessarily involve doing more social activities than you normally do, but it's maintaining social ties. So for example, if you're not a very social person, I'm not necessarily going to recommend that you go out and do more social things. It's really just maintaining whatever social ties and whatever social patterns you typically have. And maintaining those social ties has really been actually connected to potential risk of developing dementia in the future. So things like social isolation and feeling disconnected tend to be more associated with cognitive decline as we get older, and may have some association with developing Alzheimer's disease in the future as well. So maintaining social ties is very important, which can sometimes get a little bit more difficult for some people when they're no longer working, for example. Maybe they don't live nearby family. Well, whatever your social patterns are, trying to maintain those as much as possible, because those social interactions, they help us regulate our mood, they help us regulate and alter our stress levels. And when we alter stress levels, that's really beneficial, because stress can have very physical effects on the brain, particularly in that area of the brain that I keep talking about called the hippocampus, that's important for memory. Stress levels and high chronic stress levels can damage cells in the hippocampus. So one of the reasons that social activity and maintaining social ties may help us is it helps reduce our stress, maintain our emotion regulation, and that may be one of the reasons why it's linked to lower rates of Alzheimer's disease. Interestingly, there's other social and psychological factors that may be risk factors, and in some cases even protective factors for developing Alzheimer's disease or dementia in the future. So one of the things that's fairly consistent is people who have more education are less likely to develop Alzheimer's disease later on. So there's this general concept of life complexity, which involves how much education that you have, how much continuing education you engage in, how much cognitively stimulating activity do you engage in, and that can include social interaction, but things like doing puzzles, going to museums, learning languages, learning musical instruments, doing art projects, writing, all of these kinds of things. So individuals who have more of this life complexity tend to have a lower risk of developing dementia. This can also involve the kind of job that we have. So if we have a job that requires us to solve lots of problems, new problems, really challenges us cognitively, that's often something that can be beneficial for us as well. And even the people that we socialize with can make a big difference. So one study even saw that individuals who were married to individuals who had higher IQs were less likely to develop dementia. So the level of cognitive stimulation that's around us in terms of the activities that we do, but also the people that we spend time with, can make a big difference potentially in cognitive decline as we get older. And other mental health factors matter as well. You notice on this slide that late life depression, so people who develop depression later in life, after the age of 65, that seems to be a risk factor, and a fairly robust and important risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease. So depression, one of the things that depression can do to us is it, first of all, can reduce our motivation, reduce our willingness to spend time with other people, can reduce our overall activity levels. But depression may also have other kinds of physical effects as well, such as increasing those stress hormones that can damage parts of the brain that are important for memory and thinking. So depression is a pretty important risk factor that we want to manage as best we can in anybody, but particularly in older individuals, because depression may be, for some people, one of those early signs that there might be some cognitive changes happening, particularly if the individual has never really been depressed throughout their life, but develops their first bout or first episode of depression in later life. That can be a sign that there might be some cognitive changes happening too. And then in general, people who are more disconnected from others, people who are more pessimistic, people who don't challenge themselves, who are not curious, people who seek out new knowledge or information, those are individuals who may have a greater risk. And then individuals who are more prone to experiencing stress and distress, people who are what we call more neurotic, so they may be more prone to anxiety, irritability, worry about the future, for example. Those may be individuals that are more prone to developing cognitive decline as they get older. And then another piece of the recipe may also involve mental activity. So I've been alluding to that already in terms of social interaction being very mentally stimulating. But we can also do other things that can keep us mentally stimulated. And that might involve doing things like crossword puzzles, reading, Sudoku, those kinds of activities. And I'll give you some more examples in the next slide as well. But mental activity seems to be another way that we might be able to grow new nerve cells, so that neurogenesis that I talked about before. Physical exercise seems to be more effective at promoting neurogenesis, but cognitive activity can do that as well. And so what cognitive activity seems to do is it seems to increase those connections between nerve cells, those synapses. And the more of those connections we have, the better off we are. The more that our neurons can connect with each other and communicate with each other, that helps cognitive functioning. So the more complex our lifestyle is, the more cognitively stimulated we remain. What it does is it seems to build what's called cognitive reserve. And basically what that means is that there's more synapses there. There's more of those connections between nerve cells. And the more that you have of those, the more protected you're going to be from cognitive decline. So if you think about it as a very dense forest in a sense, that the more education that you have and the more life complexity and the more cognitive stimulation you have, it increases the density of that forest, those connections between nerve cells. And so that if damage begins to happen to your brain, let's say in terms of developing Alzheimer's disease, more damage has to be done before you'll actually notice or see any of the deficits or the declines associated with Alzheimer's disease. So that synaptic density, that cognitive reserve seems to protect us from damage that happens to our brain, sometimes with normal aging and with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. Just like with exercise, as I said before, mental activity can stimulate the growth of new nerve cells, increase blood flow, and can also be one of those factors that makes us more resistant to those declines in neurotransmitters that I mentioned before. And some of those declines in neurotransmitters, for example, there's a very plentiful neurotransmitter called dopamine. Dopamine is associated with our mood, for example, but it's also a neurotransmitter that's used in parts of the brain that are very important for complex thinking patterns. So in that frontal lobe that we talked about before, dopamine is used quite heavily in that frontal lobe. So if we see these natural declines in dopamine, it's not surprising that we see, first of all, individuals may be feeling a little bit more emotionally flat. But we may also find that they have more difficulties with complex thinking, with paying attention, with social kinds of behaviors. So maintaining dopamine levels and maintaining those kind of neurotransmitter levels is very important. One way that we might be able to do that is through physical exercise, but also through mental activity and cognitive stimulation as well. And so some guidelines in terms of mental activity really involves novelty and pushing yourself. It's very similar to physical activity, is that to benefit from physical activity, we have to kind of start slow, and then we have to gradually build up and kind of push ourselves a little bit more. It's the same thing with cognitive activity. So if you've always been a reader, if you've always been somebody that does crossword puzzles, I would certainly recommend to continue doing those things. But it is also helpful to build in new activities where we maybe have to learn new skills and push ourselves. So an example that I give an awful lot is that I have young children. And for example, when I watch my 9-year-old learn how to do new math problems or solve a problem, you can tell that he's really working. You can almost see the wheels turning in his little brain trying to solve these new problems. He's using and developing new cognitive skills. Well, in adulthood, we tend to spend less time developing new skills and more time using skills that we already have. So it's important for us as we get older to challenge ourselves in new ways so that we're learning something new, maybe engaging in activities that slowly and gradually kind of get harder over time. And that's the idea of incremental learning. So just gradually pushing ourselves a little bit more and more. These seem to be some useful guidelines to help us choose the right kinds of mental activity that's going to benefit us the most. And if it can involve socializing with other people, and if it involves physical activity, that's all the better. So if you can roll all of those things together, mental activity, social activity, and physical activity, then you've got a real winner. And a good example of that might be dancing. Dancing is a social activity, it's a very physical activity, but it also requires a lot of cognitive activity to plan and organize your movements. So dancing is a really useful activity, and so if that's something that either you haven't done in a long time or maybe really didn't ever learn how to do all that well, taking dancing lessons with a spouse or a partner or a significant other can be a wonderful way to challenge yourself in lots of different ways. But all in all, you still have to choose things that are fun and interesting to you. Because if it's not fun and interesting to you, you're not going to stick with it. So it should be, mental activity should be new, novel, it should push us and make us think and kind of work hard cognitively, but it's also got to be something that we're interested in and holds our attention. So those are some general guidelines. On the next slide here, I have just a bunch of ideas of activities that may fall into that category. And this list could be much longer than this, but it was just to give some ideas of what some really challenging and stimulating cognitive activities can look like. And I've got a website listed on this slide that has all kinds of what I think at least are fun and interesting and cognitively challenging activities. And they may be things that are new to you, which again is something that often is much more helpful than doing things that we normally have done in the past. So sharpbrains.com is a really nice website, so check that out if you're interested in finding some new and stimulating cognitive activities. Now, there's other kinds of cognitive classes, cognitive training classes, what's sometimes called brain training programs that are out there. And these programs may be delivered in person, like in classes, or more commonly, these are computer games. And many of these have been marketed to the general public, but particularly older individuals who may have concerns about developing Alzheimer's disease. And so there's mixed evidence in terms of these brain training and cognitive training kinds of programs. And what I'll do is I'll start with these computerized brain gyms or brain training programs. And overall, these are programs that are not going to do any harm. They certainly cost some money. There's usually monthly subscriptions, so there is a cost to them. So they're not harmful in any way, but one of the things that's been found with a lot of research is that some of the promises that companies make about these programs are a little bit exaggerated in terms of how they might slow cognitive decline or that they might be able to prevent or delay the onset of Alzheimer's disease. There's just no evidence that these brain training games can do that. So oftentimes the possible benefits are overstated. Many people do find them fun, and if you find them fun and interesting, by all means, it's perfectly fine. Again, they're not going to do any harm, but they do cost some money, and so that's something to be aware of. But they don't tend to improve skills, cognitive skills, to the point where people notice a lot of change in their everyday life. And that's really one of the key pieces of cognitive training, is that we want those skills that people learn in cognitive training or brain training to transfer over into their day-to-day life so that they function better. Unfortunately, there's no evidence right now that these brain training programs do that. They may be fun, they may be interesting, and that's great. But as far as claims go in terms of slowing cognitive decline in any way or preventing Alzheimer's disease, there's just no evidence to support that. And they may not really impact people's day-to-day life all that well. So you don't often see those kind of improvements in daily functioning that sometimes are promised. And Lumosity is one of the most, I think, well-known of these brain training programs. And they were actually fined recently by the Federal Trade Commission for making claims that were exaggerating and misleading to the public. So those are just some things to be aware of in terms of the brain training programs that are available out there. Now, one of my personal interests is in this area of brain training, or what's called cognitive training. And I'm going to tell you a little bit later on about classes that we've done at Vine, looking at some of these cognitive training classes and seeing, are they beneficial in any way for improving cognitive functioning. I'll get to that in just a minute. But there is some evidence out there that cognitive training, so being involved in a class or a program that specifically is designed to improve a specific cognitive skill, that may involve memory. It may involve problem solving, or what's sometimes called executive functioning, improving our reasoning ability, improving our reaction time. Those are some examples of those cognitive skills that are sometimes targeted in these cognitive training programs. So what you do is, through activities and exercises, you practice these skills. You practice remembering. You practice using memory strategies. You practice problem solving. You practice language skills. And the idea is that it may help improve those skills and hopefully even transfer into your day-to-day life and help you live your day-to-day life in better ways. That's the hope. And there is some evidence that cognitive training can be beneficial. one very, very large study that's been done over really almost the last 20 years now has shown that when you focus cognitive training on reasoning skills, about 74% of people improve on those reasoning skills. And they improve a couple of years later. Those benefits maintain at 5 years, and they maintain at 10 years pretty well. When you teach people these reasoning skills or processing speed skills, so specifically with processing speed or reaction time, 87% of people in those studies improved in the short term, and those results tended to maintain over 5 and 10-year periods. Now, when we look specifically at memory from that particular study, they had one group of individuals who just did memory training. And about 26% of people benefited from those memory training programs. And those results didn't tend to maintain as well over time. So that's very unfortunate. So what you can see is that some of the largest studies done in this area show that you can improve some cognitive skills. Other cognitive skills are a little bit more difficult to improve. Some of those changes that you can see or those improvements will maintain over time, but with some skills, in particular memory, they don't seem to maintain as well over time. So cognitive training seems to have a mixed bag of benefits, but then in the long term, it's less clear how well those results maintain. And then another difficulty with cognitive training is that sometimes these skills will transfer into people's day-to-day life. So people may find that everyday activities are somewhat less difficult or somewhat easier to do. But there's really a lot to be learned about cognitive training. In other people's research and including my own research, is the one thing that we really don't know very well with cognitive training still is, can the benefits that you see from the class, can those transfer into people's day-to-day life and improve people's day-to-day life? What we call generalization. Do the benefits that you see in the class generalize into people's day-to-day life? And there's still a lot to be learned about that. And right now the evidence is fairly weak that happens. But we're trying to learn more to see if that might be something that we can improve with our cognitive training classes. And I also suspect, and I hope that in the future what we see is that maybe cognitive training is part of a general set of lifestyle changes that somebody can make, both in middle age and in older age, to begin to slow or change the course of cognitive decline. And that recipe may involve cognitive training, may improving physical activity, social activity, dietary changes, managing blood pressure better, managing diabetes better. All of these things may go into a very comprehensive lifestyle package that may ultimately in the future be seen to improve people's cognitive functioning as they get older, or at least slow the decline of that, and maybe, just maybe, even prevent the development of Alzheimer's disease. So cognitive training, the evidence is somewhat mixed right now, but it may eventually be seen as part of a general lifestyle strategy to help slow cognitive decline as we get older. And so I will conclude by telling you a little bit more about the cognitive training research that I do here at Mankato. I'm involved with a group in Connecticut that's developed cognitive training programs. They've developed these programs for healthy older adults living in the community, and they have a whole suite of programs for individuals who have varying levels of cognitive decline. And we've been doing some work here at Vine with one of the classes that's for healthy older adults. And we'll be presenting some of that research in the spring, hopefully, here at Vine, to tell you a little bit about what we have found there. But that's a class called Mind Sharpener. That's for healthy older adults who have no evidence of dementia, Alzheimer's disease, or any other kinds of cognitive decline. But it may be for individuals who think, boy, my cognitive skills just aren't as good as they used to be. I'm noticing a little bit of decline. So subjectively, people will sometimes say, I'm not as sharp as I used to be, but they don't have real significant cognitive decline. They don't have dementia or Alzheimer's disease. That's what the Mind Sharpener program is about, and we've been evaluating that here at Vine, and we would like to continue to do that over hopefully the next many years. And I'm doing some research looking at the effects of those programs on people's cognitive skills. So we do some cognitive testing before people get involved in these classes, then we do some cognitive testing after people are done with the class, and then we do some of that cognitive testing 3 months later to see, okay, first of all, did we see any benefits in the short term? So did we see any benefits right after the class? And then what I'll also do is 3 months later to see if any of those benefits maintain over time. We also look to see how these programs might benefit people in terms of emotional functioning, like depression, We also look to see, do people find that they're maybe more confident in their memory after taking a class like this? So this is how we evaluate these programs, and we're continually doing this. And what we're hoping in the near future as well is to roll out a new cognitive training program for people who are experiencing mild cognitive decline. So these may be individuals who are maybe relatively newly diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, who are still functioning relatively well at home or in the community, but maybe need some supervision at home or just need some kind of caregiving, but are still doing okay. And that's what is called the Mind Works program. And we're hoping to roll out that program sometime later this spring here at Vine. And again, that's going to be a program that's targeted for individuals who maybe have some documented form of dementia, but are in the very early and mild stages of that. And we want to see if these programs might have some benefits for individuals like that. So if you ever have any questions about any of this material, please let the staff at Vine know, and I'd be happy to get back to you. But I thank you all for your time.